You know, it's always a good day whenever I start doing one of these articles and it literally opens up to a picture of Bob. And I love the fact that this has replaced the old cassettes and old the cassettes as far as the out of date logo, and it shows Bob just giving us the sort of the come on eyes. Okay, that's the last time. I'm not going to be mentioning that much after that. Oh god, that was embarrassing. So first of all, out of date because prison communications and details about the idea guys in the naivete section. We suggest you keep up with the times. And let's just talk about this first. Firstly, you wish you were me. Okay, let's take now. If we were going to take this at face value, but if let's pretend you and I know absolutely nothing at all about Chris whatsoever. So let's just assume we don't, and let's do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison, and let's do it between Chris and me, for example. Let's see, we'll do that and see how well this stands up. At this present moment, I run 24 YouTube channels. I make roughly 250,000 views a month. In a matter of weeks, I'm going to be probably getting my very first paycheck from Google for the stuff I do on YouTube. I work a full-time job, 40 hours a week. I have friends at work. I have opportunities at work. I'm striding to actually obtain a promotion. I'm currently involved with the Prince's Trust, which is not only to get qualifications in business, but also to get my own businesses off the ground. I've actually networked with quite a few people about how we can improve their businesses, and through the sort of things that I do and the sort of things that they do, we can work off each other in that sense. I'm going to likely to be running more channels in the near future. Many of these things will be expanding into different ideas. I write my own scripts. I do a lot of my own cooking. I love and take care of my parents. I take care of my brother and sister too. They too are very, very independent, unlike Chris. I pay and, I insure and tax my own car. I never had any issues whatsoever with the law. I have actually gotten some responses, some very positive ones for the works in terms of when I write for other people and stuff like that. And there probably would be a lot more, but it's fair to say that if Chris seems to is under the impression that, well, if I were him, and I know he's talking about somebody else, but let's be honest, you could replace yourself with any other person and it would have likely fit the bill. I'm going to say that actually, you know what? I work hard because a lot of the work I do demands a lot of hard work, considering, I do the editing, the animating, the broadcasting, the networking and all that fun stuff. So it's basically a well-oiled machine run by one person. Chris is probably actually quite similar in many ways as using as a machine as a sort of counterpart. Unfortunately for Chris, what he doesn't seem to understand is the fact that it just blatantly comes across as arrogant, and no workman, no CEO, nobody in the world is going to be respected if they are viewed in the light of being arrogant. And it just comes across as quite rude, in all honesty. And I'm actually gonna. It's some way I've thought about like improving my my mic quality is by actually lowering my seat and actually just adjusting my my monitor. And so okay, so that's actually quite a lot better. So like I said, even though, again, life is hard and stuff like that, and, there are some things that are incredibly unfair, like just how much I pay in national insurance, how much I pay in tax, how much stick I get from certain persons at work, I still do it. You know what? Because the alternative is literally go back to universal credit, and I haven't or go back on the dole, as they say, and I haven't been on the dole in just coming up to 4 years. And that was only in part because COVID-19 made things very awkward. But you know what? I made a promise to myself that I would never go back on the dole ever again. And you know what? I'm going to, by the time I get enough to actually kickstart my own businesses and actually earn so much from what I do outside of my job that going to work will seem like pocket money by comparison. By the time I come to making roughly 15,000, probably £20,000 a month, I won't ever really need to go to my current job again, but I will stick with it because, you know, that some things have got to be paid for and it's got to come from somewhere. Now, why exactly Chris thinks that, again, in case of somebody else, they thought they would be him, I doubt it, because of everything we knew of Chris and everything we are going to know afterwards. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever feel like you're in a situation where you seem somewhat lost and you don't really know where you're going in life, just remember, Chris is under the impression that he is someone to be envied of because of Chris's stance in society and as far as the world is concerned. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I secretly think that Chris even himself knew that all the way back in 2010. Well, pride is not a sin, for one needs some self-esteem and confidence to motivate themselves and inspire others with soul and heart. This is CPU Blueheart distinguishing pride from arrogance, ignoring that pride can have both a positive and negative connotation. That's true. Egotism is the most important and self-destructive of Chris's flaws. Yes, flaws, by the way, plural. There's a lot more involved, but it is this egotism that may one day lead to someone playing Kick the Autistic in real life. I'm surprised this wasn't something they picked up in prison, but no, as far as we're concerned, Chris's time in prison has mostly been as you may be. And by the way, this still remains one of the best little bits of fan art that somebody has done. This is Chris's ideas of, like, you know, how he views himself, and notice the brown staining here, and that's not just from this cushion. I'd love to know who actually was who like did this, as well as probably the original concept of, like, this manifestation of egotism, because you got the likes of, I think that's meant to be like Henry VI and Van Gogh here. But I like that, if anything else. And there's a lot to discuss here. Besides, Chris strokes his ego by having two of Ben Saint's characters admire him, which is just, yeah. Are you that dense strawberry milk? This is the legend, the extra-dimensional, the goddess herself, Chris Chan Sonichu. And by the way, as far as my knowledge is concerned, Ben Saint has never actually made Chris look in this light or anything like that. I've never even noticed the shoes as well. And stuff like that, or noticing how just bad Chris's art always was, but this is like something else, I guess. So anyway, here we go. I've seen those crappy AI replicated art pieces that look better than this. Origins. When you don't have people in your life pushing you, can you push yourself? By Tori Amos. Why is Chris such an egotist? In his sheltered childhood, his enabling parents taught him to shift the blame from all of his troubles to other people. A sense of entitlement, again homegrown, skewed his perception of the proportionality between his problems and those of other people. Chris doesn't completely lack empathy, though. He isn't a psychopath, but the internal scale by which he weighs the importance of himself against that of others tilts in his favour. That problem was compounded by his autism, making it difficult for him to understand social cues and relate normally to his peers. He grew up in a very different world, and we're not just talking about the 1980s. We're talking about the 80s, the 90s, the advent of the rise of things like social media in the 2000s, and the fact that because Chris had never been taught that he was wrong in any other instant, then he probably confirmed in his mind that an attraction sign and using terms like boyfriend, free girl, and openly displaying a sense of homophobia and borderline racism was just okay to do. I don't care if you say, well, that's just the state of Virginia, you know what I mean? No, that hasn't got to do anything like that. You could come from anywhere in the world and people would still view him as a scumbag. They could be from Cape Town, they could be from Kingston, they could be from Swaziland. The people will view him as a scumbag. The problem was compounded by his autism, but that explains why Chris was an egotist. struggled with egotism or has tendencies towards egotism. While Chris's childhood was less than ideal, it shouldn't have been quite so crippling. Time and experience should have helped temper his ego, and his half-brother supposedly suffered far worse and still managed to make something of himself. His parental half-siblings managed to acquire doctorate degrees, becoming an eye doctor and a math expert respectively. They were able to develop and learn from the past. And before people say that people compounded with autism are not capable of this, I would just like to remind all those who are curious now that, now technically I have Asperger's syndrome, which is kind of the same thing as autism. It's not 100% the same, and because I don't have all the time in the world to go over it, the importance of this is that allegedly doctors, or when I was tested for when I was about 2 years, I think it was either 2 or 3 years old, so this was like 2000 or 2001 when I was tested, and they declared it was a very mild form of Asperger's. So you could say I'm on like the very low end of the spectrum, but what people need to understand is that the problem is not so much that I was on the spectrum at all, it's the fact that being on the spectrum still means you are on the spectrum, and it can have its effects, and there are some times where I just feel like, particularly in unpleasant situations, and listen, I've had my fair share of unpleasant situations, everybody has, that's just, sometimes life is a bit unfair, but you know what, I had two options about this. I could either go at it and make the most of a bad situation, and listen, I'm very, very good at making the most of bad situations. In fact, quite a lot of people are. What I had problems with is openly admitting it to other people that I was perfectly okay with this, and to expound my, my life's experience, because some people say that people just do that without having to think about it, and that it's not special to compound a certain level of self-belief or self-confidence. The irony is that some people try to compound me the irony that boasting of being confident, talking about confidence makes you very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Insecure. However, that's not the case, and to be honest, the majority of people I've talked to about this would not really describe me as insecure, to my knowledge anyway. Whether they really mean it is a different matter entirely, but most people I've spoke to are quite earnest about this, and so I just have to go off that. With that being said, when it's in relation to Chris, I don't understand when people were being brutally honest about the stuff. I mean, I could go over literally the rest of this. I mean, what is it now? 6:20 at night. I could compound this until it's time for me to go to work in 24 hours time, and we still wouldn't get to the bottom of it, because Chris ultimately chooses to ignore any real substantial criticism. Chris's general lack of body proportions. I mean, it's okay from if you were maybe, let's say, 7 to 8 years old, but you have to understand is that most people do not look like pink spoons or that one character from Toy Story 4, and how this is about as minimalistic as... You could probably create a maybe more interesting story if literally you just used shapes on top of shapes and made them as characters. And this is something that goes as far back as the early 20th century, when people try to associate characters being in the form of shapes, but that's a different story itself. Especially then when we come to the dialogue and the fact that we're pointing what seems to be the end of Chris's elbow talking as opposed to his actual mouth. Has anyone ever noticed that before? Is that Chris is very, very... isn't particularly very accurate with his speech bubbles. They're meant to be pointing at his mouth, not elsewhere on his body. Chris's development isn't just delayed, it is arrested. His egocentrism has persisted well into his 30s, when most children usually grow out of it around the age of 7. Autism isn't to blame entirely. While autistic people's idiosyncrasies can make themselves appear self-centered on the surface, only a few are self-absorbed. Most still have interest in others, and many get help to develop coping strategies and social skills. Not Chris, though. Well, yeah, if there's one thing I obviously will say, even from this point in the article, is that Chris is the way, and you could say, whether maybe from a social services point of view, Chris never really got the full support he probably should have. I mean, let's face it, the hoarding situation wasn't just a thing that was encompassed from before Chris moved back to Charlottesville after his graduation at Manchester High. But that's again, that covering Chris's like childhood is really, really hard. Not because there are so many like moving parts to his early years, but also because there's too many moving parts that he probably still hasn't disclosed, and there were lots of things he disclosed about his childhood. Chris is still an egotist, though, because he lives in a social time capsule that has allowed him to carry on for over a decade without a single life lesson. Yep, and Noel has also explained this before, is that Chris has learned not a single thing in his time, and things he should have learned a lot sooner to prevent certain situations in his life from coming out, which we know it didn't do because Chris is the way he is. Most people usually who don't suffer from the level of egocentrism usually can actually learn from their experiences, unlike Chris. And I've mentioned this before about you should view each experience as something to be learned from, like there's a lesson involved. Chris doesn't do this, which is, again, very strange, because from Chris claiming he was a fan of My Little Pony and Care Bears and whatever else, they have lessons in their stories. In fact, you know what? If Chris ever was fortunate enough to ever watch the show Bluey, then you know what? He would have learned that there were very important lessons in that show as well. Hey, listen, when I was like babysitting my younger cousins recently, I actually got to start watching Bluey, and listen, I've seen Bluey and Coco Melon in my time, and I've got to tell you, I'd much rather take Bluey any other time. In fact, I've often said before that, and you can, again, whether or not Chris took so much of this early years education and the things he watched on TV when he was a child, but there were also plenty of other shows that were slightly older, or slightly for maybe older demographic than Bluey and Sesame Street. Although, for my money, Sesame Street has got to be the single hardest show in the world to write for, which is literally my dream. If I could ever like write an episode of Sesame Street, absolutely I would, because I think it is the single hardest show on television to write for. I'm not even joking about that. But anyway, as I was saying, He-Man, Thundercats, and there were quite a lot of other shows in the 80s that were for an older demographic, but also there were a lot of morals and they taught a lot of things. One of the popular ones in Thundercats was that rules are only meaningful if people learn to follow them, which is not exactly nuanced, but if you presented this to Chris back in 86, he probably would have taken this on board, because there's a lot to be said about that. The enablers. I'm sorry about these rantings, by the way, but I think they're just, it's fascinating to go over these sorts of things, because, well, it makes you wonder just what did make Chris this way? What is the attraction and what keeps us fascinated? The enablers. Drunk or not, they had me at an old age where my mother was so close to menopause and my father was a senior citizen. I was truly a miracle. Or you are just incredibly fortunate. By the way, I know Chris isn't listening to this, but I remember 10 years ago during an RS class, and we were doing like, it was some kind of like sex education class we were doing in RS. It wasn't like the sorts that we did before. These were more about like nuclear families and mixed race families, that sort of thing. Which, even to this day, I'm looking aboard because I think it was very confusing about telling us things that we probably already knew. It was just a matter of, like, learning the words. And some people were talking about how they were born prematurely. In fact, there was one guy in my class called Dashi. He was 25 weeks. He was born at 25 weeks. He was so premature that there was a difficulty about if he was even going to survive. And I don't remember if it was a result of an emergency C-section or not. But what I'm trying to make is that he didn't consider this like a miracle. He didn't think that this was like something to be fascinated about. And again, listen, make of that what you will, but what I'm trying to say is that if it's on the subject of egotism, this is something that sticks to Chris as well. Because listen, I've known some pretty egocentric people in my time, but the funny thing is that when I was in school, very few of them were. But many of them were just sort of just pottering about, getting on with it. Whether or not you just want to say they were like knowing exactly how to like function in the world already and stuff like that. Many of them like had girlfriends and were like all that good stuff and stuff like that. But it was interesting. Like one of these days I would still probably have to talk about, well, I might even reference things about that happened in my school days, but I think again this sort of comparison is the sort of thing that makes like Chris's case extremely interesting. Is it because it's a different generation thing? Is it because, well, when I was at school 10 years ago, I was in the run up to my GCSEs, and was it because my generation had like more technology and had more opportunities and stuff like that? Is it because, or what do you guys reckon? You know, you be the judge on that. Chris's parents are enablers par excellence. Barring unrelated to catastrophes, there is no earthly reason why a grown adult in his 30s should live at home with his parents without even helping them out. Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, that is absolutely true. You know what? I may go to work, I may have time off work, I may have downtime. I still help my parents around the house and stuff like that. You know what? I clean, I cook, because my parents are getting on in years anyway. Not to the extent of Chris, but you know what? I should be able to help out, and there was no reason whatsoever for me not doing it. If there was any other task that, you know what, at the moment should be worth doing, then it's simply got to be that way. And actually, I'm going to pause this moment because I've just been reminded of the fact that I've got to set up my dad for a Zoom call he's got to have, so I'll be back in a tick. I'm so glad I brought this up because it got me to remember. It's funny how these things work out, eh? Back in a tick. And welcome back. Chris's parents are enablers par excellence. Barring unrelated catastrophes, blah blah blah. Autism isn't an excuse, especially when Chris's autism is as high functioning as his activity exemplifies it to be. Adults with far more crippling psychiatric problems, from personality disorders to schizophrenia, live far more independently than Chris does. Although in the case of Daniel Larson, that might be for slightly different reasons. Even people who suffer from an intellectual disability, who would be called the R word in yesterday's parlance, can still often find work and live much more independently than Chris. Chris isn't one of those people at all. He can read, write, and work a computer, as well as talk. Incomprehensible though it is. The 90s are long gone. We don't need to constantly clarify that autistic people can be bright or successful. Bob may have missed that memo, mistakenly believed that a modern special education program would be the same as old-fashioned mental institution, rife with padded cells, straitjackets, electric shocks, and routine frontal lobotomies. This has led to the family to push a conspiracy theory against his school district, and Bob fled the Charlottesville area with Chris until he graduated from high school. For children like Chris, special education in public school is generally geared towards helping the child understand how their disorder affects their lives, and what strategies they can use to minimize its impact. This is a well-documented and well-supported strategy, but it relies on buy-in. Chris's parents clearly never bought into these strategies, because they never fostered any interest in instilling any form of independence in Chris, thus undermining the entire regime of regimen of special education, and ended up with a man-child with entitlement issues. That does describe Chris. Speaking of education, It can also be said the school system was yet another enabler of Chris's formative years. This was especially true at Manchester High, where Chris received passing grades on schoolwork he didn't do correctly, yet still eventually graduated on honour roll, or so he says. Presumably out of excessive pity on the teacher's part. Were that indeed the case, it might have encouraged Chris to put in less than half-baked effort into things and yet act like the end result is something spectacular. Possibly, but when... It's interesting as well that usually as well something that happens is that usually classes like... mostly in high school, they usually compare and contrast with quite a lot of other people. And I wonder if they ever did this with Chris, or whether or not he just simply chose to ignore them and think that everything he did was brilliant. Maybe, but because we have no other evidence to the contrary, that just might be the case. Monthly tugboat. My father helped me get my social security set up. I get more a month than I could at a job. Chris seems to be taking pride in the fact that he is lazy as fucking lazy can get. Because that is absolutely not true. Even people who are on minimum wage, like I do, we earn way far more than Chris ever realizes this. And certainly in this country, at any rate, I get far more through actually going to work than Chris ever does. But considering Chris's employment record is limited and abysmal, we could only assume for 1 second that if we convince him that it's the case, then therefore he has to believe it because, you know. Chris receives disability insurance from the government, or what he calls a monthly tugboat, as he calls it. Although it's intended to supplement income for a menial job, such as a fast food joint, Chris uses this check as his sole income. He is simply unwilling to work on anything except mass debating, playing video, and stalking women, both young and old. Yikes. People who have made a wide variety of political arguments for and against the tugboat. Some argue that Chris is abusing the welfare system. Others state that he deserves his check. Still others claim that his parents abuse the system by proxy or that the system itself is flawed. But these arguments are besides the point. Regardless of whether or not he should have the tugboat, it is an undeniable factor in making Chris's lifestyle, and thus his worldview, sustainable. About as sustainable as it can get, but what can you do? The information superhighway. A number of the Oregon Trail generation, Chris has made many significant memories before 1991, when the World Wide Web made internet access feasible for the masses. However, he would use the internet regularly by the time he left high school. Born in 1982, he came of age in the year 2000, placing his childhood in a different millennium from his adulthood. Windows XP came out soon after, and with it came a multitude of prosumer creative programs, giving Chris something to do after kissing his gal pals goodbye. Metaphorically, not physically, thank goodness for that. Chris could record and share his own music, publish his comics online, and even create his own DVD. These services were previously reserved for professionals who had access to expensive studio equipment, but they were now in the hands of the masses. Later in the decade, Chris became involved with YouTube and Facebook, providing even more venues for self-publication. He no longer needed to wait for the news media to notice him. He could be the media. For better or worse, mostly for the worse. And you know what? Some part of me also thinks that maybe it wouldn't nearly be as bad for Chris in terms of the internet if he could possibly make any money out of what he was doing anyway, or, barring this, he just made his own material, and even the stuff he sucked at, he got better at, and he could make money of it over the long periods of time. This, again, things that seems to be incredibly simple, and if Chris was at all serious, which we kind of know he isn't, these sorts of things should have just been like second nature if he wasn't willing to actually get a proper job. Because there are plenty of people who make YouTube their side hustle and then turn it into their main hustle. But Chris is sadly not one of those persons, unfortunately. Chris joined YouTube much earlier than many more respected web celebs. during a time when most people saw it as a silly cat video website, not a career. But remember, this was Chris's closet brush with fame since the local news. Blind luck and the cherry-picking fallacy. What the hell is a fallacy? Fallacy. A contest or two here, a 9-second local TV blip there. The results are that outside events most people never experience have stroked Chris's already monstrous ego. From being featured in Nintendo Power to being featured on the news here about the Pokemon craze that hit America, to just sort of walking in the background of McIntyre Park. Consider that Chris has produced a huge volume of fan mail, letters to the editor, internet commentary, and other drivel over the years, partially because he doesn't have much else to do. True. Each letter to Nintendo is a message in a bottle. Most of them never return, but the one that does, on an official letterhead and addressed to Mr. C. Weston Chandler, is confirmation of his celebrity. Well, maybe as far as he's concerned, but, well, unfortunately in the real world is that people who only appear for seconds usually are only in the public zeitgeist for seconds. You need to be really, really dominant in your approach, and unfortunately that just doesn't quite seem to be the case. Not even by the standards of Chris. Yeah, it says here that, that it goes on to say that Nintendo of America has some of the most devoted, enthusiastic fans of any game developer. Each week, they receive hundreds of thousands of suggestions about their games and systems. While they would love to use ideas from fans to develop actual products, due to the volume of the requests they receive and the resources it would take to process them, they do not accept unsolicited game or product ideas. And probably would also have to go through studios who would greenlight their own IPs, so it would be doubtful even by this point. But they are committed to being at the leading edge of game and hardware development, though, and they can be sure that they are constantly at work developing new and exciting products and game ideas. Now, here's the interesting part, where they quote about how I actually go further about them changing their minds and actually accepting the idea and helping me, making it totally real, with the video games and the TV animations and the action figures and officially released my personal approved medals. They say that the best way to let other fans know about my idea or to generate hype about the future game I'd like to see is to post the ideas to the forums on their sites. And again, it's genuinely a good idea if you actually have a product that is successful already, because usually spin-off material works in lieu of this. Or if you did want to make it into a game first, then work on something that's, you know, that's something comparable to being in a video game. Did Chris even have like a foundation? Did Chris have a main idea, a story, or anything like that going into this? Probably not, unfortunately. The concept of form letters does not seem to occur to Chris, who seems to think the letter was written specifically for him. As if Chris didn't think his material was golden to begin with, he got a second nod from Nintendo Power for his epic Animal Crossing documentary. I have seen that before, and it's actually quite engrossing if you believe that. And a page in the PVCC's form is just icing on the cake. Even before his E-fame, Chris had plenty of evidence to convince himself that he was creative, and not just a high-volume, whiny jerk that presented or pestered his way to acknowledgement. As he graduated from PVCC in 2006, his writing shows that Sonshu was, in his mind, already tested. There was just some small threshold of notoriety or connections that needed to be breached to become a true media sensation. On top of that, Chris has a huge amount of free time to inject himself into situations like the McIntyre Park meetings, which always allow him to cherry-pick more moments of recognition. A tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement by the local council seems cute to us, but it is serious business to him. And since Chris cherry-picks only the reinforcement that he wants, not what is coming to him, he legions off trolls just to add the fire. Delusion led to him believe that he had a legion of fans for a time, A few hundred emails in his inbox confirmed it, for all the wrong reasons. You see the sort of trouble that actually having excessive pride and hubris can lead to somebody? Big fish, small pond. Chris is a small town girl living in a lonely world. They wouldn't let him on the midnight train. He wouldn't even know where to get it, because it would be going anywhere. Let's take a look at the cities of his life. Ruckersville is such a tiny place that it only has one other notable resident, NASCAR driver Philip Morris, who is no Jeff Gordon or Danica Patrick. The neighbouring city of Charlottesville is most relevant for the UVA, the Monticello, and a handful of political rallies. It is a historic town, but it still has a small town feel. It offers suburban conveniences like public parks, movie theatres, and a multitude of strip malls, but it lacks the hallmarks of a big city. Chris's teenage environment, suburban Richmond, is much more robust. However, Chris had a very sheltered adolescence and experienced little of what growing up in a large metropolitan area usually entails. Richmond also suffers from being far from any other major cities, except for Washington, D.C. Chris rarely visits big cities that would quickly humble him. He lives in a very isolated world. His hometown has a smaller population than some high schools, and it isn't really known for up-and-coming artists. His main frame of reference was his classmates. Many of them took art as an elective, without any plans of becoming professionals. Additionally, him succeeding in spite of his autism might have only been relevant because the small school population made him one of the few autistic kids in class. In reality, autism is a fairly common condition that's more often than not quite manageable with the right help and support. Whether you want to say this is literally just Chris's, things being different in the 80s, and people going undiagnosed, that might possibly have something to do with it as well. Chris peaked in high school. He bases most of his merit on his various HS accomplishments, and he talks about the time as if it were the time of his life. Might possibly be the case. He considers himself bilingual because he took Spanish classes. He takes pride in the fact that his school displayed his work publicly, even though schools do that all the time. And not usually just inside, sometimes in the hallways as well. He takes pride in the fact that his school displayed his work publicly. As they do anyway. Chris's comic book incarnation bears a strong resemblance to his high school self. Comic Chris doesn't wear glasses, the real Chris didn't wear them until 98, and he's in good shape, much like high school Chris, likely because of gym classes. Chris would often bring up his placement on the honor roll as proof of his intelligence. And quickly how things changed, and his mental health would sharply decline after graduation. Not just from the influence of Count Graduan, even in that case. Chris has taken his big fish mentality out of his small pond and transferred it to the large ocean of the internet, not knowing that it's filled with much larger sharks. Catherine suggested that Chris ought to move to a place like San Francisco or Seattle, or anywhere outside suburban Virginia. She told him that these places are more LGBT friendly and have more job prospects. A lot of people have actually suggested that to me before, and listen, I know fine well that for me, if there were more job prospects, I should either move either down to London, maybe to Brighton, possibly even as far as Cornwall. But even then, is it the case of the pond being too small, or whether or not I should actually learn how to succeed in my hometown first, or because it's just outside of Newcastle, so I should be able to if I could make it in my hometown first, then I should be able to make it elsewhere. Because there's no shortage of very rich and affluent persons in my hometown. So if I can make it work here, then there's a good chance I can make it work in other places. It probably also helps that my hometown is actually is home to a lot of people who are retired, and a lot of people who are just starting to have families here in my hometown. So therefore, it should stand to reason that actually there's plenty of people who are either A, retired but are still working because their assets are that valuable, or that those who are just trying to make a nest, if you will. And to be fair, Ponteland is a great place to grow up, especially if you plan on going to the schools locally, which I didn't, and if you actually take the time to know a lot more of your neighbours. Depending which part of Ponteland you live, it's almost dealer's choice, but you can make friends quite easily in a place like this. It's actually, among other things, and I don't know how the US would even go about doing something like this, but apparently of recent, Ponteland got named the 34th best place to live in the UK, according to the Daily Telegraph of 2023. And it beat things like Cambridgeshire and Windsor as well, if call it what you may. Possibly Ponteland is better to live in than possibly even Buckingham Palace itself. That might be going a bit far, but it does also suggest that as well, maybe perhaps the environment was just more friendlier to Chris. Despite, was the game place originally in Charlottesville or something like that? But I'm sure that even if Chris had the time, there probably would have been neighbours in Richmond and Ruckersville who probably should have known him, or Chris known them. But Chris told her, but there's no San Francisco in Virginia, completely missing all of them. Wanting to have his cake and eat it too. Chris chose to stay in his small town southeastern bubble because it's easier for him. Yet he would clearly benefit from living in a more developed, liberal-minded area. Possibly, but as history has shown, is that all that glitters is not gold. But again, how would you know all that glitters is not gold if you've never actually seen gold for yourself? In the same conversation, Chris stated the real reason for not leaving is that he doesn't want to leave his mother behind. Since she is already on bad terms with her other adult child. Well, yes, but to be honest, just leave for a couple of days, Chris, and actually see what she does. Because to be completely honest, if I left to go down south and a couple of days later my family were phoning the police and stuff like that, I'm pretty sure that would get social services involved in some respect. Chris didn't consider that his Aunt Harriet could take Bob in, or that she could use her retirement insurance to live in an old folks' home. Instead, well, we know what happened there. Chris even brought up that he doesn't want to move out of the state after Bob dies. Chris did acknowledge the perks of moving out of his valley, though, but it's only logical for him to move out. What is a person obsessed with fame and art doing in a place known for neither? Well, again, I have to bring this up, is that if for what I'm going for, probably the sort of place I'd imagine moving to is possibly like California is probably where I'd imagine myself going to, only because there's either California or probably southern Florida. But then again, I don't think either state is particularly known for being particularly safe. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, listen, I've never been to Miami before, but I've heard some things about it, and some things that probably I should reconsider my options. But then again, literally any place can be dangerous if there's trouble. Not everybody is going to be living in fear. In fact, quite a lot of people live freely, and not too many people actually do horrible things just because they're capable of doing it. Some of them do, yes, but that, again, you shouldn't really live in fear. That's the point I'm trying to make. This isn't really concerning like Chris's ego. This is more concerning about what's going to make him comfortable and something that's going to suit him, even though in his current situation not much is really suiting him anyway. Why does a loud and proud bisexual trans woman want to live in a place where most residents are massively homophobic and or anti-trans? Why does the world's most documented autistic person want to live in an area that, by his own admission, doesn't understand autistic people? Well, do you think, at the same time, one, do you really think San Francisco is going to be any more welcoming to Chris specifically. Your guess is as good as mine. Second, where's he supposed to live? You know, what's he going to do? Ring up Jacob Sockness, and goodness knows what Sockness might do in the middle of the night if Chris isn't looking. I'm not saying he wouldn't do that, but with what I know, I probably wouldn't go near Jacob. And you know what I mean? And all it would take is for Chris to do something stupid, and he would get in trouble anyway, because Chris isn't particularly renowned the world over for keeping his hands to himself, learning to behave himself, and finding ways to get into trouble seemingly of his own accord, no matter what happens. I want you guys to bear in mind the Sonic's Blue Arms was entirely of his choosing. It wasn't motivated by anybody. It all began with his complete intolerance of it. So, make of that what you will. The trolls didn't help, certainly, but Chris just went far too far. I mean, we know that, but it's worth mentioning it. And why does someone who desperately wants a compatible partner limit himself to a tiny dating pool and then resort to long-distance troll dating where there probably is someone for him in the Los Angeles area? Yeah, but you know what else is in the Los Angeles area? South Central, Inglewood. A lot of very dangerous places in the US, and I don't particularly know if Chris has, like, the mental fortitude to know what streets to stay away from, where he thinks he's sort of like, if he asks somebody and somebody immediately takes it the wrong way and, you know, chaos ensues. I'm not saying, again, that's not always the case, but even Hollywood isn't particularly known for being safe most of the time. And why does Chris want to treat his dwelling as a temple for all to flock to, when it's so remote that Google Street View doesn't cover it? Because it's easy to be a big fish in a small pond, even after pissing off the other fish and getting banned from your favorite hangouts. Aggrandizing is fairly common in the family, and they can generally get away with it because of the small town mentality. Chris's family loves to bring up Bob's injection molding patent. He claims that we wouldn't even have a simple water bottle without it. In reality, plastic injection molding was invented before Bob was even born. The Wikipedia article doesn't even mention Bob. All he designed was a control panel for one specific machine. If Bob didn't design it, someone else would have. Even Cole Smithy, who managed to escape the Weston Chandler household as a young adult and go on to have a fairly successful career, bills himself as the smartest film critic in the world. Was this before or after he gave Toy Story 3 a negative review? Some things may remain a mystery. Now we move on to another huge aspect of Chris's egotism, is his narcissism. I was mistaken, but not wrong. So yeah, exactly. That just about says it all, doesn't it? It's unlikely that Chris actually suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, although it's likely that someone in his family does. There probably could be a lot of people, but you know what? It doesn't mean it has to come out into the open. For all we know, every person on Earth may suffer from this, but whether they choose to act upon it or not, or just straight up be a dick in real life, is again here or there. While extreme self-centeredness and egotism is often conflated with the term narcissism, NPD is also an existing mental condition, categorized by more factors such as emotional manipulation or split personalities for different people. Given the fact that Chris himself is too stupid to actually emotionally manipulate anyone, in a way, let alone get manipulated himself, Chris most likely isn't a narcissist in the real sense. However, it's possible that Barbara, who did employ plenty of abusive NPD-like traits such as using suicide baiting, might have influenced Chris's behavior in some ways. Chris actually mentioned in a theatrical manner considering suicide on his Facebook posts several times. Yes, that is true. Even for something as inconsequential as Sonic the Hedgehog's arms, to shove his own name, initials, and creations every chance that he gets, specifically other people's works, if it guarantees fame. That's kind of like really, really hard to forgive, to be honest, because yes, Chris only does it for attention. Also, he would have gotten away with it for a lot longer if, you know, somebody either just called him out a lot sooner and just straight up, like, told Chris, you can't do that. But the problem is that because people don't know for certain, then who's to say Chris isn't just, you know, he was telling the truth. So that's why people chose whatever stance they did, and yeah, but it's still pretty scummy all the same. That said, while a lot of factors like his relentless attention whoring or his lack of empathy coincide with symptoms of the disorder, factors of his ego were mostly results of his shitty upbringing and awful luck with winning contests, giving him a huge sense of self-importance. Not to mention his lack of empathy for others was also partially caused by his autism. If Chris does have NPD, he likely has a low-functioning variant of the disorder, and it may be hard to delineate his potential NPD symptoms from established ASD ones. Further reading is required to confirm the difference. I don't know whether or not this is an article that leads to anything, or misdiagnosing narcissism, Asperger's disorder. So let's just, I'll tell you what, we'll take a small break just to like go through this to see if there's anything we can actually get out of it. Asperger's syndrome, renamed as the Autism Spectrum Disorder Level 1, is often misdiagnosed as NPD, though evident as early as age 3, while pathological narcissism cannot be safely diagnosed to prior earlier adolescence. In both cases, the patient is self-centered and engrossed in a narrow range of interests and activities. That does describe Chris. Social and occupational interactions are severely hampered, and conversational skills, the give and take of verbal intercourse, are primitive. Yes, the Asperger's patient body language, eye-to-eye gaze, body posture, facial expressions is constricted and artificial. Chris, in a way, yeah, sort of, yes, maybe. Where were we? Is constricted and artificial. Akin to the narcissist, non-verbal cues are virtually absent from their interruption in others lacking. Yes, the gulf between Asperger's and pathological narcissism is vast. The narcissist switches between social agility and social imperative voluntarily. His social dysfunctioning is the outcome of conscious haughtiness and the reluctance to invest scarce mental energy in cultivating relationships with inferior and unworthy ones. When confronted with potential sources of narcissistic supply, however, the narcissist easily regains his social skills, his charm, and his gregariousness. Yes, maybe, and maybe yes. Many narcissists reach the highest rungs of their community, church, firm, or voluntary organization. Well, that's definitely not that. Most of the time, they function flawlessly through the inevitable blow-ups and the grating extortion of narcissistic supply, usually put to an end to the narcissist's career and social liaisons. Well, Chris never got anywhere close to the top, so we can probably safely ignore this. Although, again, it would be inevitable that, well, Chris removed himself from going to church for many years anyway, so we can safely put that down to probably not. The Asperger's patient often wants to be accepted socially, to have friends, to marry, to be sexually active, and to sire offspring. Yes, true, but that's, like, not quite unlike everybody else. He just doesn't have a clue how to get about it. His affect is limited. His initiative, for instance, to share his experience with nearest and dearest or to engage in foreplay is thwarted. His ability to divulge his emotions stilted. He is incapable of reincorporating and is largely unaware of the wishes, needs, and feelings of his intercloteus or counterparties. Inevitably, Asperger's patients are perceived by others to be cold, eccentric, insensitive, indifferent, repulsive, exploitative, or emotionally absent. not all at the same time, but that is a good highlight for Chris. To avoid the pain of rejection, they confine themselves to solitary activities. But unlike the schizoid, not by choice, they limit their world to a single topic, hobby, or person and dive in with the greatest all-consuming intensity, excluding all other matters and everybody else. It is a form of hurt control and pain regulation. Thus, while the narcissist avoids pain by excluding, devaluing, and discarding others, the Asperger's patient achieves the same result by withdrawing and by passionately incorporating in his universe only one or two people and one or two subjects of interest. Both narcissists and Asperger's patients are prone to react with depression to perceived slights and injuries, but Asperger's patients are far more at risk of self-harm and suicide. The use of language is another differentiating factor. The narcissist is a skilled communicator. He uses language as an instrument to obtain narcissistic supply, or as a weapon, to obliterate his enemies and discarded sources with. Cerebral narcissists derive narcissistic supply from the consummate use they make of their innate verbosity. Now, to be completely honest as well, oh dear lord, they really did think of everything, didn't they? Not so the Asperger's patient. He is equally verbose at times and taciturn on other occasions, but his topics are few and thus tediously repetitive. He is unlikely to obey conversational rules and etiquette, for instance, to let others speak in turn. Nor is the Asperger's patient able to decipher non-verbal cues and gestures, or to monitor his own misbehavior on such occasions. Narcissists are similarly inconsiderate, but only towards those who cannot possibly serve as sources of narcissistic supply. Chris, again, the more I go into this, the more I'm beginning to realize that Chris might be one, or he might be both, or he might just be the worst aspects of both. Refrigerator mothers. The concept of a refrigerator mother has long been debunked. Autism is a brain disorder. Well, that's not really true. It's a neurological condition, so not really a disorder. It is not linked to bad parenting, but a dead narcissistic mother can cause her autistic child to defend himself by developing narcissism. Well, that's more just as a result of, like, traits that work downwards, and also, well, it's a kind of a yes and no thing. It's the traits that Chris inherited from both his parents, as well as the fact that, whether Chris wants to admit it or not, Bob baiting Chris into doing unspeakable things to get him to fall in line did sort of work, so he has to sort of take these on board in some way, because he has to admit that they worked, in a way. ADHD has been initially linked to the precursors in children of adult narcissism and psychotherapy, conduct disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder. A bad, dead, cold mother fosters in the autistic child narcissistic defenses, and in her other children attention deficits, hyperactivity, and antisocial behavior. These dysfunctions make it difficult for the child to translate his or her reflex empathy into mentalizing a theory of mind. Early childhood abuse and trauma, therefore, inhibit the development of a mature form of empathy, with cognitive and emotional components. There are 3 problems with raising awareness and educating people about autism spectrum disorders. 1. We don't know the ontology of autism, what causes it. We kind of do and don't, and whether the brain abnormalities often observed in autistic patients cause it, are caused by, or are merely correlated, effectuated by a third common factor, probably the environment. Autism is a family of disorders which have little in common with each other. Some autistic persons are high-functioning and accomplished. Others self-harm, are hypersensitive to stimuli, and non-communicator. And 3. The long discredited refrigerator mother theory blamed emotionally unavailable, dead, or frigid mothers for the pathogenesis of autism in their children. This deterred parents from seeking help. The ignorance, taboos, stigma, biases, prejudices, and lack of evidence-based theories and practices that pervade mental health apply even more so to autism. And listen, I know there's probably a lot more to go into here, and thanks for Malignant Self-Love by Dr. Sam Vakin. The only thing I feel like I think could worth add to this point before we move on is that it's not really Chris. If Chris didn't have if it was like a different thing Chris was interested in, like maybe Lord of the Rings, he probably might have used this as some way to like maybe beat someone over the stick with. But because this is entirely of Chris's own creation, this is something of Solitude was something of his own mind. In a way, we can't necessarily say that it wouldn't have been the case if Chris had something else tangible to his mind. Because if failing that, the only reason why Chris would be mad is that he had virtually nothing to his name. So, whether you want to say that Solitude is just his coping mechanism, or that it was fueled long ago by environmental factors that more resulted in making Chris feel good about himself, you're more than free to do so. You just need to change this one bit. So let's move on, shall we? And now we come to Chris's manifestations, which only inflame his ego, because if there's nobody there to outwardly oppress him, then it's the only way he can self-assert his own sense of dominance. Because people who don't have any semblance of dominance whatsoever have to compensate them by making stuff up on their own. Chris's egotism manifests itself in a variety of ways. Unwarranted self-importance. I have had my way over 1 million fans worldwide since I went online in before 2000, which is completely untrue. As overwhelming as Chris's unwarranted self-importance is, it's easy for the novice observer to get lost in the sea of Solitude shit and assume that he's just confident in his e-fame. Of course, you say, he's got 1 billion hits on YouTube and 1,000 emails in his mailbox. He's going to think he's hot shit, though, isn't he? Like every other laughed at not with dumbass on the internet. But nothing sums up Chris's deep air-baiting USI like this missive to Mary Lee Walsh. And of course, you can see Chris's level of graciousness through this photo, which is so pseudo an apology to Mary Lee Walsh, but it kind of isn't. First of all, you see Slowee Orion trying to apologize by doing this. I'm sorry for using your name in vain, and when I construed PVCC citizens and made you look a fool for about 6 years, Mary Lee Walsh. This is disregarding the fact that Chris originally named Slowee Orion Mary Lee Walsh in the first place, and that was the intention for her going in all this time. Then you hear Chris saying, and I'm sorry for letting Slowee Orion let away with it for so long. I pray we can put this whole mess behind us, Mrs. Walsh. Chris's level of graciousness is only confined by the fact that it has to be a two-way street. You know, he can't, Chris, because nobody has ever told Chris that when you apologize to someone, you don't bargain with somebody over an apology. It has to come from you and only you. That's how it's meant to be. As overwhelming as Chris's unwarranted self-importance is, it's easy. Okay, so we've just done all that. Sorry. But nothing sums up Chris's deep and abating USI like this missive to Mary Lee Walsh. Mary, I've slept on it, and I have realized that note hanging is not the way to get attention. Good start. And I don't really want to meet with you, Ivan, or Susan. No offense. Not so good. I'll tell you what, let's forget the meeting. And if you will allow my newsletter to stay in distribution, I will do all of the following. I will never hang notes on the wall again. I'll consider stopping my silent treatment on Susan. I'll consider knocking you and Susan up my scale of respect, each by 2 points. Please reply via email, Christian C. He never got a response to this letter, apparently. I think it was also one of the reasons why he was still banned and they were unwilling to negotiate. E-Fame just adds a whole new dimension. He was misunderstood genius before, now he's a misunderstood genius with a personal army. I'm working on it! Let me do that stupid video so I can tell everybody I'm in command to get everything. Help me get everything off the internet. in the infamous "This Is My House" video, where Chris, realizing that leaking information on the internet was probably not a good idea. It's so bad that when Chris meets someone new who claims not to know who he is, he seems skeptical and rather surprised. Y'all should know me by now, but if you don't, I am Christian Weston Chandler, the original creator of Solitude, the electric hedgehog Pokemon, back on March 17th, the year 2000. Chris in only his second YouTube video. You know what, it's only bad that he would do that on my mother's birthday, St. Patrick's Day, but whatever. The instant gratification, instant acknowledgement, and instant attention, good or bad, good or bad, that has come with his minor e-fame over the last few years, has thoroughly convinced Chris that people do read everything he writes, and that his YouTube messages invariably get to his target audience. I realize I am famous like a princess, Chris on Twitter in October 2017. Unfortunately, the only royalty he probably feels like is Princess Diana. Notable resident in Ruckersville, Virginia, alongside a NASCAR racer and about the 29,000th most popular individual in this world. So where is the Wikipedia article about me? Chris on Twitter in 2018, like he needs more information written about him. He also describes himself as managing the varsity team in high school, when actually he was the water boy. But if, even after all of this, you're still not convinced that Chris has unwarranted self-importance issues, consider this little tidbit. He posted autographed pictures of himself on eBay, looking like this. No less. And this is the first time we'll actually go on to one of the references for this. And we'll have to click on this. And yeah, it still looks as though Chris got bitten by a mosquito and... yeah. Well, you get the idea. Make of that what you will. It's almost as if that shit speaks for itself. Fixation on self-image. Chris has created many avatars of himself through mediums, which is as Pogs, his comic character, as a level figure, as Smash Brothers, for Super Smash Brothers, amiibo figurines, another tomboy figure of himself, a Christine doll, which is just a My Little Pony Equestria Girls doll, Skylanders, more, Transformers, MOP, Ridiculous as like 2 forms of MOP, another Christine doll, Funko Pops, and as a trading card. Persecution complex. Chris has a lot of problems, and even the ones he takes responsibility for are still out of his hands. His school was mean to him, he didn't deserve that F in English or the 1 in CAD, and he didn't deserve the 24/7 trolling, among other things. And if this wasn't bad enough, he thinks every authority figure in the land is conspiring against his love quest. Then in mid-October, the quote-unquote Dean of Student Services, Mary Lee Walsh, approached me and pulled my sign away from me and told me to, "You are not allowed to find true love here." My heart was shattered that very moment, unlike that wart thing on Chris's face from years to come. It doesn't help that he's engaged in a quagmire of a war against the homo rumors that those damn trolls keep spreading about him, with a second front versus the copyright violating thieves. It's out of my control, I don't know where to go, I don't know where to go. In a May 8th video, Chris blames the Greene County School Board for pretty much every misfortune in his life. Well, that's just ridiculous, just to be honest. Why? Really? From being banned from the game place to becoming the social outcast that we all know and tolerate, thereby cementing the notion that Chris will never actually take responsibility for his actions. The only time Chris had actually stepped up and admitted responsibility was the accidental formatting of his PlayStation 3. And given the lack of things after this, you could probably only imagine that they weren't kidding. That probably only was. Interesting, really. Naivete. Chris's simple-mindedness and gullibility are the stuff of legends. Like George W. Bush, he only deals in absolutes. Either you're with him or you're against him. But unlike Bush, who will raid you for oil, This has been very obvious to Chris in his answers to the mailbags, where he refuses to listen to any talk, even from professionals, even from the very people who know better and would probably benefit Chris's life completely if Chris ever chose to mention them. But I mentioned all these things way back in the mental health care videos. About the similarities between Asperger's syndrome and autism, denies that there are any shortcomings in his work, and shrugs off any advice about how to improve his health or appearance, labeling anyone who suggests he has any kind of shortcomings a troll. Chris equates honesty with divulging every last detail about his life. Nothing is too candid for Chris. Getting haircuts, drinking his own semen, shitting his pants, or even giving away his home phone number and home address. The only thing he hasn't done with wild abandon is given away his social security number, and when that happens, it won't be a surprise to anybody. Though surprisingly, he hasn't done it to this point, so good for Chris for at least knowing not to do that. His gullibility is astounding. No matter how many times it's happened before, Chris is easily led around by trolls promising China, threatening his identity, and most damaging of all, playing into his otherworldly delusions and fantasies. The earlier trolling schemes, such as Blanca Wise, Panda Halo, and Jimmy Hill, got Chris to jump through hoops and expose so much information about Chris and his personality that they had to start this very wiki itself, to keep track of just all of it. Another example of Chris's gullibility is one Miss Jackie Romy, a sweetheart Chris met earlier in 2011. Despite her obviously being a troll, proving by a mysterious leak of videos that were sent only to Jackie on February 2012, Chris has refriended her on Facebook after blocking her the previous April. Only time we'd ever told it would end up seeing Chris cosplaying or making an ass out of himself, which he eventually did, and again, time and time again, in videos only aimed at Jackie. Unfortunately, though, it appears not to have happened. It's pretty obvious that Chris had only done this because he believed that he would score with Jackie sooner or later. And if that's all it took to convince her, then fair enough, Chris will do it. It didn't mean he had to try and do anything special or different. He was very much the same as he was before, and that's good enough for Chris, because for even trying to aim higher, or even just a little bit higher, was about as much as ask for Chris to reach the moon, for example. In 2009 and 2010, Chris slowly began to learn to distrust trolls or to keep more of his information secure. However, many of his trolls believe this is akin to putting a shock collar on an animal, eventually to stop being shocked, not because they actually understand or care. An animal will start doing as it's told. Eventually. Hubris, the pride before the fall. I love myself, and it's obviously just Chris twice. It's fair to say that Chris is a bit of a narcissist. I even especially dislike the people who have mugs saying, "I love me." I mean, how bad must your self-esteem must be when not only you're going to buy into that shit, also that, because, listen, companies are perhaps some of the biggest narcissists on the planet, but it doesn't stop people from buying their stuff, you know what I mean? I'd say I'm all around, you see. The problem is that I have too many skills that I am good at. No, that's the opposite round, Chris. You have too many skills and you're not good at any of them. You might say that I am a jack of all trades and a master of none. No, you're the jack shit of all trades and you're the master of none of them. And Chris apparently being right about the last part. Numerous times, Chris has shown that he believes he has powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal autistics. In fact, so much so that this attitude has transcended mere hubris. Instead, it more resembles a mental illness. Not only is Chris convinced that his writing, musical talents, and art are without peer, he also believes he has supernatural powers along with the lines of Wicca or voodoo. And he doesn't just have the power to create, his is also the power to destroy. This line of thinking is exemplified by Chris's acceptance that Ryan Cash committed suicide just because he withheld Sonichu updates, and would worsen when he believed that his curse actually caused Liquid Chris and Mary Lee Walsh to have some sort of horror befall them. But those are just the most insane moments of cognitive dissonance. What about the time he went into hysterics when he didn't get recognition for his art at high school graduation? I should have been highly recognized for my artistic talents. I showed in many art classes for the award ceremonies before graduation day. I felt crestfallen, greatly from not getting recognized for any of my talents. I excelled in math too, for the love of God. And again, you have to also as well, because there must have been plenty of other people who probably didn't get recognized too, Chris. And listen, again, whether we want to say Chris' work was just not up to par, which is likely the case, it might have also been the case there were plenty of other people who didn't get recognized too, Chris. It's not all about you, even on a day like your graduation day. Or his reaction to losing the parappa contest. So that's sworn on my autism. Justice will be served to the 7 people of those 4 videos. Just because Chris thinks that doing little effort was worth it to win a PSP. All of the above is consistent with the behaviour of small children, who are isolated from the real world by a lack of comprehension and limited mobility, believe themselves to be godlike beings. This belief is gradually destroyed as the child goes to school and encounters outside authority, leading to acknowledgement of the fact that they are, in fact, ordinary people. Of course, since Chris is not only autistic but also extremely sheltered, he still manages to cling to his belief by focusing on specific aspects of his life and constructing elaborative fantasy worlds. This is also probably why he sees mundane chores as horrific signs and trials of strength and will. In psychological terms, this can be referred to as psychological notony, which is basically the retention of juvenile traits well into physical maturity. Well, physically he's done one of these things, you could say, but not quite the others. Also consistent with his childlike mindset is his apparent belief that he has supernatural powers. In Freudian terms, this is referred to as omnipotence of thought. Basically, in the same way he does with religion, Chris cherry-picks elements of his life to validate his fantasy of control, which is more systematically displayed in the Sonichu comics. Taking this into consideration, it's likely that Magi-chan is yet another Mary Sue for Chris, serving as a kind of avatar for his desire for ultimate authority. Why he felt it necessary to make yet another character to fill this role is unclear, considering he's already established himself as the one true god of Quickville. Another aspect of Chris's arrogance, and again caused by his childish way of viewing the world, is visible in a phone call with Alec Benson Leary, the creator of Asperchu. In the call, it is obvious Chris does not follow a mature procedure for developing a stance on issues. Where normally an individual will learn information about the issue and from there decide how they feel about said issue, Chris does it the other way around, and decides how he feels about something, then refuses to believe, understand, or even humour any evidence to the contrary. So basically he does everything backwards, and his responders are perplexed beyond words, even while Chris is acting these things out, when he should have had time to ponder on them. While most people have very strong beliefs in some issues, so much that they automatically have a prejudice against people who believe differently, politics, religion, etc., Chris has this perspective on everything. He takes a position on matters, then finds ways to back it up and ignores all evidence for the opposing viewpoint. This is called a confirmation bias. For example, Chris has decided homos are bad, so he selectively finds information that backs up his stance on the matter and ignores anything anyone will... Whoops, I pressed something by accident. But I'll get to that in a second. Has decided on bad and will tell him about why his homophobia is bad and makes him a bad person. He will then go as far as to pretend he can cure homosexuality with his own blood. He'll probably give people diabetes, is probably more the case knowing Chris, unless disliking homosexuals means he will not get laid. And to this day, the only evidence Chris ever did to getting paid is if he just straight up paid for it. This is most apparent when he takes two contrary positions about a similar topic. The obvious example of this is Chris's understanding of the way parody functions. Chris will defend his right to make Sonichu to the hilt by claiming it is a parody, but then states that Aspetu is a bad thing because it is a parody of a parody. As you can see, Chris has decided that he has every right to make Sonichu, so he backs this up with statements about his right to parody existing trademarked characters. But conversely, he has decided Aspetu is bad, so he supports this position by stating it is a parody of his legitimate work that was already, in his words, a parody. Huh? A literal example of the pride before the fall would be Chris's series of Facebook posts between April and June of 2012. In April 2012, Chris believed that he had utterly fooled the trolls when he made a series of posts mocking them. He even went so as far as to post screenshots of the Cwiki forum members talking about it. Note that in several of the screenshots, Chris believed that he had uncovered a scheme to start a poster campaign about him in Charlottesville. According to his Facebook post dated 4th of June 2012, he had called the cops and basically admitted that he completely fell for it. He then recorded an angry voicemail greeting before quickly deleting it. Compared to an earlier voicemail he made, one can clearly see how humbled he was. Not very much is the word to put it. A more recent example of Chris's pride before an ego superseding the efforts of people around him can be seen in Sonichu Special 5, in which the captain vociferously praises Chris, flanked by his creations for providing a good service to us all in the world, when in reality the opposite was true. Chris had been manipulated by the idea guys, and the captain, a member of the guard dogs, was the actual person providing said services in attempting to break Chris free of their influences. For example, Sonichu Special 5, in which Chris found a way to twist a situation in which he was being helped into Chris himself doing the helping, ending up with him receiving praise from a fictionalized version of one of the people trying to help him out. This here trying to be the captain. Thank you, Christine, I shall take care of it. You provide a good service to us all in the world. Which is the only way Chris could justify having to sell his high school amethyst ring. You know, in a time when he gave away thousands of dollars, a position he wouldn't need to be in if Chris wasn't so dumb. Well, I could have used a stronger word, but we all know what... Yeah. Materialism. I want Julie. Yeah, love is my first priority. But then I really want my stuff back. Chris caring more about his precious PSN account and Sonichu website than his sweetheart. Imagine if he had said this to a real girl, but, you know, that's not going to happen anytime sooner either. It is clear that Chris is a materialist, a common symptom of narcissistic personality disorder. Buying and hoarding large amounts of crap that make him feel good about himself. He may even believe that his unhealthy amount of children's toys might attract a sweetheart, when any human being would clearly see that this man is delusional. He also doesn't seem to have a problem with getting money for sitting on his ass, claiming he can get more from his tugboat than he could at any actual job. Or he has absolutely no concept of money, and believes he is entitled to everything he can buy. This stems from childhood, when Snorlax would take Chris to the toy store and encourage him to talk by giving him toys if he could read their names out loud. Ever since, he's believed that just by being autistic, he deserves everything he gets his grubby, sticky hands on. This mixture of compulsive hoarding, compulsive shopping, and autism is bad news all the way. He compulsively hoards all of his toys and video games because he wants to give them to his daughter in the future. Bullshit. He also seems to enjoy collecting things, which may explain why Pokemon appeals to him so much. Chris compulsively buys everything he can on the PlayStation 3 and is more concerned with trophies than actual gameplay. Most of the games he's downloaded have never been played, but the important thing is that he has it. Hoarding items in cases other than OCD is a sign of intellectual disability in older children. He may have inherited this behavior from his parents, especially Bob. His tender misanthropy. A tender misanthrope is, by definition, someone who despises humanity in general. That's a bit going far when it comes to, like... Chris, is my forehead gone, like, really red, or is it just me? But is ever ready to make an exception for the real people. In other words, an egotist who pretends to be benevolent. While it's obvious that Chris is an egotist, he truly believes that he is benevolent. He is the perfect example of a tender misanthrope screaming death threats at what he knows of humanity, seeing as the only social contact he gets is from the internet, while also believing that he is a kind, loving person who can give advice and act as a role model for children. Another part of the definition states that, well, in the words of the famous song, "Do I look like a motherfucking role model?" Anyway, another part of the definition states that a tender misanthrope feels certain of being able to love real people if only they can be found, or failing that, to transform existing false people into idealized real people through social and political programs of the tender misanthrope's own making. The way that Chris treats homos, seeing as he hates them all, no matter what he says, and wants to turn them straight by placing them into co-ed prisons, reprogramming them into straights via concentration camps, or by creating a vaccine that cures homosexuality, certainly fits this description. The fact that he also generalizes trolls as homos also supports this. If that does not convince you, however, if that does not convince you that Chris feels he can make people into what he can by emotionally attaching himself to, there are also other obvious examples of his unique delivery of his intentions. 1. Disregard of rules of conduct online, which, oh, we know that. Do not delete nor censor my bombastic protest. Chris in Encyclopedia Dramatica. That's like the first big red flag there, is to use the word bombastic protest. Oh dear, especially in a post 9/11 world. Chris has little regard for the rules of online communities. When he joins up on websites, he tends to do things his way. Basically, the anti-Reddit user, but mostly. He assumes that his own niche in these websites is under his absolute control. For example, he assumed that Wikipedia would allow him to post anything on his personal user page, or that Encyclopedia Dramatica would remove material critical to him if he just asked nicely. Sites like DeviantArt and YouTube allow community participation, presuming Chris is in a community that accepts him because of who he is and not the other way around. Chris simply disallowed comments, or later on just ignored every comment he received. Chris also assumes that when other people host websites for him in case of Wikipedia, he's given the final say on all matters. His record for getting permabanned is currently at 2 weeks on Flipnote Hitina, where he foolishly tried to re-upload Flipnotes that he'd previously been removed from for breaking the rules, without bothering to find out why they had removed him in the first place. His Facebook account encountered a cycle in 2015, and specifically in July, where it would be removed and put back up again. Some of Chris's posts contained sexual content, such as photos of lizards in amplexes, thumbnails of tribudism, screenshots of sexting, and a drawing in which he was drenched in lemonade through a China-shaped melon. Or lemon, I should say. Which he even bragged about how jerks would be offended by it. Surrendering information. If there is one thing that Chris's ego would simply not allow, it's suppressing himself from giving away too much information about himself. If he feels that bragging about something would give him a one-up against the trolls, or make himself look good, he'll freely announce it for everyone to hear. The most glaring example of this is the entire Wikipedia, which was created using a lot of information provided by Chris himself. Back in the day, Chris viewed himself as an extremely popular internet celebrity with a true and loyal fan base, and as such would divulge a lot of information about himself so people would know him better, inclusive of personal information that nobody in their right mind would give away. However, there are times when he would do the opposite and surrender information that would make him look horrendously bad, sometimes without provocation whatsoever. His enthusiastic revelation of his own fecal incontinence is the shining example of this. Whilst this practice has diminished in recent times, with Chris making himself scarce out of fear that trolls would have more ammunition to use against him, his habit of needlessly surrendering information still manages to surface. For example, when he claimed to lose his virginity, he couldn't help but announce it on his Facebook page, especially when prostitution is considered illegal in the state of Virginia, all the while swearing up and down that he would never ever divulge any details about this to the trolls again. Mere weeks later, more details emerged on Facebook, leading to speculation that he would actually bought a hooker, since we all know the inevitable result of his sweetheart search. While he ended up confirming it on the 1st of May of 2012, along with attending a Mythbusters tour, something which wasn't even brought up but still revealed anyway, all the while claiming to remain button-lipped on the matter. Only time would tell if and when Chris finally reveals everything to silence his naysayers. After all, it wouldn't be the first time it's happened. Sure enough, in December of 2014, a leaked account of Chris's experience with the hooker was released on the Kiwi Farms. He just never seems to learn, does he? In 2013, Chris's habit of needlessly surrendering information returned with a vengeance. Chris threw a temper tantrum on Facebook, and many would have assumed that it was business as usual, until Chris made the fatal mistake of revealing the reason why he went on the warpath. Somebody had uploaded his status updates, complete with the ones that were hidden, onto an Imager account. Aside from the usual whining about how lonely he was during this time, these screen caps not only revealed what he was up to in the silence between 2011 and 2013, but also uncovered a very ugly side of Chris. One post in particular revealed that he was angry at the fact Mims had a girlfriend, and demanded that somebody should kill her simply because Mims was a jerk. Holy shit. The fact remains that the only one revealed all of this unsavory information was not the trolls, as Chris would try to have you believe, but himself. The next year, Chris encountered a man trying to put out a bushfire near his house. However, he believed he was trying to make it even worse, and thus uploaded the bushfire video, wherein he would be dropping the address of the rental house in the video title. Way to go, Chris. Things that would have been avoided if Chris were even slightly more intelligent. In 2021, this would eventually prove to be Chris's ultimate downfall. There's a shock. In late July 2021, Chris told Bella that he had sexual intercourse with Barbara Chandler, his own mother, even going so as far as to describe the acts in uncomfortably graphic detail. One would think that Chris, being in the highly delusional state that he was in at the time, could have easily been dismissed here, until he confirmed that it was all true when pressed by the truth by Dylan Thomas. As a consequence, many horrified listeners immediately contacted law enforcement, as incest in a Class 5 felony in Virginia, and to say nothing of the rhetorical rape charge that might go with it, despite the fact Chris admitted to Dylan that there were several points in which Barb simply asked Chris to stop. Due to Barb's possible dementia and possible unwillingness to have sex with her own son, even more consequences would follow. Chris was removed from his home via an emergency protective order and became the center of a humongous media circus that even had Weens tracking him down in real life, resulting in his eventual arrest on stream on the 1st of August 2021. Yeah, I will literally cover this entire story because the only reason why I didn't back in the day is because details were still lacking despite how fast the events of it were. But we'll get to that in due course. I can promise you guys that. Fishing for sympathy. I am so smart, and yet I still have to learn everything. I still have so much to learn. Two brain cells fighting for third place. That's what this is. In many conversations with Chris, there have been quite a few instances where he would outright fish for sympathy, in the hopes that people would take pity on him and, in doing so, make him feel better about himself. One such example is the father call, where Chris constantly talks about the trials and tribulations of carrying a doghouse to an unimpressed Matthew Devoria, from whom he was trying to seek approval to date his daughter. Said trials and tribulations amounted to housework and being teased on the internet, which Chris felt was on par with Matthew Devoria carrying his dead friend's body during Desert Storm. In his later email exchanges with Jackie, Chris is quick to paint himself as a misunderstood victim whenever Jackie rips him a new one over issues such as his habit of lying, being a hypocrite, and even being inconsiderate towards her. Even in recent times, he has not cut out this habit. His Facebook entries blame his trolls for making his life a living hell, one in particular lamenting that nobody cares about him except his own mother. No, that isn't even true either. The attention he gets from his mother, Barbara Chandler, and his friend, Anna McLaren, is textbook mollycoddling at best. Chris has spent his entire life being catered to by his parents, notably well past the point of social acceptance. Isn't that the truth? To the point where he depends on them to bail him out of his numerous messes that he gets himself into. It comes as no surprise to literally everybody, then, that this is, combined with him being autistic, has poisoned Chris's mind into thinking that this is how everybody should treat him, by default. And if people don't see things his way, he'll be more than happy to point out the heavy burdens he faces daily, almost as if he expects them to instantly take back their mean words and feel sorry for him. The habit of wanting sympathy is so ingrained in Chris that he instinctively hedges when he makes a positive statement about himself. An example is from a video in which he said, "I am so smart," and immediately followed by downplaying it and saying he still had much to learn. No, Chris, any smart person would actually say, "I would consider myself wise, and like any wise person, it simply means that I don't know." Circa Carry On My Wayward Son by Kansas. Do you see, again, that's the sort of thing that works, because if I claim to be a wise man, it surely means that I don't know. Why couldn't Chris spout a bit of genius wisdom by extracting some actual intellectual depth from, I'm getting too into it, moving on. War against the ego. One of the main forces opposing Chris's ego are the White Knights. These misguided souls have attempted to get Chris to understand that what he's doing is ridiculous and that he needs to grow up. Fast. Instead, he brushed them all aside, assuring himself that he was the true and honest victim, and could do no wrong. One of the more popular White Knights, Vivian G, became a troll when she couldn't get through to Chris. You gotta find, ironically, like the one person who theoretically should have been on Chris's side, and it annoyed her to such an extent that Chris just had no choice but to make things so bad that it gave Vivian no choice. When asked to get real psychiatric help, Chris has said that his church counselor, Rocky Shoemaker, is enough for him. No, it probably wasn't. And that she could do so much more than someone with an actual degree in said field. He seems to believe that because her title includes the word counselor, she is every bit as qualified as a real doctor. The fact that most pastoral counselors see people for free probably helps as well, since Chris could never spend part of his precious monthly tugboat on something more useful when there are video games to hoard, not buy, but hoard. There were some instances where it seemed that the trolls had made a breakthrough by breaking Chris, only for him to get right back up and continue with his antics. An example of this would be Casey, who led Chris on a while until she dropped the bombshell that she was going to marry Liquid Chris, but not before having her father point out every single thing wrong with Chris. A normal person would have been utterly devastated by the turn of events, and some would even use this experience to better themselves. Chris, on the other hand, perked right up when he obtained a letter validating Sonichu, forgetting about Casey in mere days, just like she had predicted. And there's probably like more examples of like Chris's like egotism, and probably just as much here. But to be honest, if I just go onto like the list of Chris's like stuff here, is that because we might possibly do like this separately and maybe talking about it a bit much else, because to be honest, this article has like gone on for, I don't want to make this article at least 3 hours long. Yeah, let's do it. Screw it. I just wanted to do it. Okay, so apparently I must just really not like myself, because we are even going to cover all the examples of Chris's ego, and the only thing of worth mentioning is that there's information on Sonichu's issue 14 and Sonichu specials 5, 6, and 7. To the top of my knowledge, nothing important in 14. Apart from it's mostly to recount the events of what I believe is just Chris's time at a convention. Sonichu Special 5 is more about how the captain makes Chris look good by giving away something that Chris desperately needed to sell. And 6 and 7, I honestly couldn't tell you. Sorry. So in the real world, Manchester High. When Chris graduated from high school, he actually cried because he believed that he deserved a number of artistic awards for his artwork. By his own admission, he also made a scene and ran out after getting his diploma, eventually having to be consoled by his mother and gal pal Tiffany Gowen. PVCC. After being expelled for his appalling behaviour by the student's dean, Chris felt the need to write the then standing President of the United States, George Bush, the idea that a standing president would be willing to use his clout to reverse a local community college's administration decision is ludicrous at best. The gameplays. Chris, a regular patron, acted as though he owned the store. He was rude to the other customers and staff, abused the access to a flat-screen television, and was an all-round pain for the manager and later owner, Michael Snyder. After many antics, he was banned from the place. Chris filmed a half-assed apology 9 months later, not because he was sorry for his actions, but because the store was the only place that he had his Eye of Judgment cards. Chris also attempted to incite harassment of employees of the store, using the very fans he had chastised mere weeks earlier, simply because Michael had refused to remove his ban. Prison. During his time in jail following the 28th of October 2011 incident, Chris stated he refused to eat the prison food, since he had never done it and was not going to start anytime soon. Nor did he get any thinner as a result, and eating the food was beneath him. Later on, after being sent to jail following an incestuous affair, Chris writes a letter saying that life events at present and so far can directly be compared and matched with which have been chronicled of none other than Jesus Christ of Nazareth in any holy Bible. Yeah, that's not more such ego. That's more like Chris denying all aspects of reality and doing things that are straight up deranged. GameStop. Following the incident on the 26th of December 2014 incident, in which he maced a male employee after fleeing a GameStop which he had been banned from previously due to his vandalization of one of their Sonic Boom displays, he went on to say that he was in fact the victim of the whole situation in a lengthy Facebook post. With actual people. Sarah Nicole Hammer, one of Chris's first crushes, Chris made the small booklet Chris plus Sarah's Life Shares in an attempt to win over her on her 21st birthday. The booklet was a mere major ego trip, talking more about him and less about her, with the two of them replaced with Sonichu and Rosechu. He later cast her in his Sonichu comic and having her break up with Wes Isley before disposing her when she was married away to William Spicer. Megan Schroeder. For the longest time, Chris actually believed that he and Megan were going out as a boyfriend and girlfriend. He even attacked someone for getting near Megan. When the infamous She Came for Quick.jpg picture was discovered, Chris actually thought that the reason that she was upset was because she wasn't used to sexual things, and not the fact that she realized that Chris saw her as nothing more than a sex toy. He then tried to make Megan believe that the bullying from those amongst ED was much worse than the fact that he had did the picture because he was afraid of trying to rape her. Although, again, Chris's behaviours before this were already creepy anyway, so... Well, that's the good point. Yeah, again, Megan probably should have just cut ties a lot sooner than this. He also insisted that he was under much more emotional pain than she was, somehow believing that trolls posting pictures of Rose True with a pickle on the internet was worse than a so-called friend sexually harassing and drawing porn of you. Chris would later blame ED for the fact that he had lost her friendship, not caring it was his fault in the first place. Jerk cops. Thanks to Chris's various runs-in with the law, Chris has a very skewed view of law enforcement. After being tossed out of Walmart and Target, he deemed that security guards were evil and just trying to play Kick the Autistic and prevent him from completing his love quest. However, following his arrest on the 28th of October 2011, Chris has now assumed that all law enforcement is evil from the word go and has gone out of his way to make sure they never take him into any sort of custody again. That's quite extreme, but what do you expect from Chris at this point? Vanessa Hudgens, or Joshua Martinez, used the identity of the High School Musical star to troll Chris by pretending that Vanessa wanted to ride his dick. The fact that Chris actually believed a bona fide celebrity wanted to give him China speaks volumes about his hubris. The fact that Chris believed he was actually seeing somebody called Ivy anyway. The Sonic 2 promotional video. In the two-part video, Chris shows to the camera an elegant drawing of the two main heroes of the comic book made by a fan called Ali. Not only does he proceed to comment, "Rosie's tale was wrong, but I'll forgive her," he presents a drawing made by himself as the better version. He was wrong, of course. Shigeru Miyamoto. Chris was convinced that Miyamoto, who is a world-famous video game designer and creator of the beloved and legendary franchises like the Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong, The Legend of Zelda, and Star Fox, would not only be honoured to meet him, but in fact even more honoured to meet Chris than Chris would be to meet him. Yikes, that's really pushing it. Then, even after having his game proposal rejected by Miyamoto, Chris still remained convinced that Miyamoto was only holding out on him and would surely accept his offer in the near future. Jackie. In the final email exchanges between the two, Jackie quite accurately pointed out many of Chris's flaws, also taking the time to rationally explain what he was doing wrong and what he could do to fix things. However, Chris took it so completely the wrong way, claiming that she was being mean to him and hating him by pointing out his flaws, still believing himself to be flawless and special. Couldn't be any further from the truth. And then the online world. Little Big Planet. When Chris had shown up on Little Big Planet community and posted videos addressed to them, he once again said people should know him by now, and he immediately assumed people would praise him for his levels, especially the collector's case, which he thought was the most original Little Big Planet idea level ever. I've never played Little Big Planet, but I'm pretty sure there's got to be more out there, if we're judging this on Chris's expertise. Web Soup. When Chris learned that one of his videos was featured on an episode, he took it to be a good thing, not realizing that the show made fun of people on the internet. Downsize Sega. On February 2nd, 2015, Chris took credit for Sega's downsizing, stating that him and his Pale Arm Crusaders, with their boycotting, had damaged Sega enough to force them to close office. This is despite the fact that normal market forces had been the supposed cause. Literally nobody is joining Chris's cause on the fight against the Blue Arms. And Sega is the publisher of all Sonic games. They give some nicely needed recent perspective on the size of his ego. All on the cases that Chris doesn't really seem to care what happens, just as long as, well, small things, like really small things, like the colour of people's arms is the thing that Chris thinks is wrong about a video game, outside of everything else that's wrong about Sonic Boom. Sonic Forces. In November 2017, after playing through the newest Sonic game, Chris unlocked customizable options for the new avatar selection. One of these included eyes with heterochromia. Chris immediately assumed the unlockable was inspired by him, since his right eye is green, while his left eye is a shade of blue, like purple, the combo of blue and red. Really? Contests. Harvey Birdman commercial. In an attempt to win a contest involving the animated avian lawyer, Chris went to great lengths to talk about himself, his rivalry with Mary Lee Walsh and Sonichu, but very, very little about Birdman himself. He even got the character's name wrong initially and left it in anyway. The Chop Chop Master Onion Rap Showdown. In his reviews of the top 10 videos, Chris highly praised his entry and claimed it was the best, after losing the contest to Adam Stackhouse. Chris would have a major hissy fit over the loss, proclaiming even the slightest mistake as cheating, despite the fact that Chris himself had broken numerous rules in the process, thus disqualifying himself, including loading the contest with fake votes for him and bribing his stepbrother to vote for him. Even worse, he attempted to fabricate the PlayStation webpage to show him that himself had won and not Adam. That's something that literally kids do, but what can you do? Others. Greene County School Board. In one video, Chris proclaims that the Greene County School Board, who sought to help Chris when he was younger, initiated a massive conspiracy against him in order to keep him in his autistic shell. This also included paying off a realtor to keep their house from being sold and paying off Michael Snyder to keep him out of the gameplays. Unban contracts. Chris demands the likes of GameStop and Best Buy to unban him for his incidents over there, even though they had every right to ban him for his conduct. Not only that, but he also demands that they do not call the police against him, which is illegal since contracts cannot be used to protect from criminal prosecution. I don't know whether Chris ever knew this or whether or not he didn't know this, but just decided to ignore it because he just thinks he can get away with this sort of thing, thus making it null and void. And he believes that not signing would prove that they are the most uncompassionate and lacking of heart and soul of any person, and are a bunch of unwelcoming, immature, rat-ass bastards. He even goes as far as to say that his ban from those places is outdated, similar to how he tried to convince Michael Snyder that he needs to forgive and forget, and that the ban is a human rights violation because he's a lesbian trans woman. He really does use that excuse. Is no shocker, but also just sad and pathetic. The affirmations list. A 3-page long list Chris wrote in March 2021 of his positive traits, and it consists of thoroughly delusional assessments for stroking his own ego, which is of no surprise to anybody. In the comics, I did an awesome fucking job. While issue 0 and issue 1 do focus on Sonichu, shock, but Chris Chan does take over as the main character throughout issue 2, 5, 6, and 7, with Sonichu only as a supporting character. And in his infrequent appearances, he invariably sings Chris's praises. Issue 8 and issue 9 see Sonichu taking back his major role as the main character, but at this stage, he's just a Mary Sue for Chris. The main story arc of issue 10 is the resurgence of Chris and his elimination of every enemy he has so far. He also portrays himself as skinny and handsome, although this doesn't happen till said issue 2, and throughout the comic series, sporadically gives himself insert character superpowers that are never explained. He even makes several episodes that dramatize events he had in real life, with the extremely self-indulgent fantasies that are described below. Chris's ego is in full bloom in the comics. The name of the city in which he and his Electric Hedgehog Pokemon strive to protect is known as Quickville. The city's currently in C quarters and currency is in C quarters and W quarters. One of the major drinks in the city is known as Quick Cola. The radio station is called KCWC. The hotel is called the Double Quick. Even his Hyrule ripoff is called Rule Quick. Basically, everything is named after Chris. That's not even going to the Stalin levels of extremism that he goes to. The Sonichews and Rosechews he created refer to him as father, his self-insert as mayor, but never ever performs any mayoral duties whatsoever, and his actual role is more like a god king than any kind of elected official. As Chris says, there is no elections in Cwikville. Instances of Chris's ego in the comics. Issue 3. This issue has a semi-fictionalized account of an incident Chris had with the managers of a McDonald's. He was loitering and soliciting, and knowing that a 25-year-old morbidly obese autistic man-child creepily looking at patrons can't possibly end well, security threw him out. In his comic book, however, Chris exclaims that the jerk-cops are conspiring against him. Preventing him from finding true love, he turns into Chris Chan Sonichu and defeats them with the help of Darkbind Sonichu, who admits he only helped because Chris was his creator. Confirmation bias, if ever there needed to be one. Sonichu issue 5. This issue has Chris write Sarah Hammer out of the comic so he could focus exclusively on Megan Schroeder, the new object of his desire. While Sarah did marry a man named William Spicer, Chris was not present at her wedding, and had never met Spicer. And as he was represented in the comic by a generic Yu-Gi-Oh character, the next episode has Chris fawning over Megan, and she over him. In reality, Megan saw Chris only as a friend, and was constantly rebuffing his advances. The episode features 2 different endings because Megan either did not like the original ending or objected to being featured in the comic at all, most likely the second one. Issue 7. Chris is envious of Bionic's ability to screw Magagi until Megan holds his hand, again implying romance, where none exists. After Chris gets trapped in the time void, he mixes both fake memories from the comic with real ones, like Megan dumping him and his denial of having drawn She Came for Quick.jpg. He blames it on Ed, even though he was the one who drew it and uploaded it onto the site himself. Mary Lee Walsh's invasion of Cwikville and her defeat at the hands of the Sonichews and Rosechews, and Joshua Martinez hooking up with Vanessa Hudgens. Issue 12-9. The comic that features a new self-insert for Chris named Nightstar, which is a blatant Mary Sue empowered with story-breaking psychic abilities. Nightstar meets with Chris's comic incarnation, who is explicably coloured to resemble yet another depiction of Chris, and helps him transform into a body that looks like herself. The character's full names are Christine Knight Western Star Chandler, which Chris wrote without a hint of irony. Chris also depicts his real self in the comic as an alicorn, an extremely rare species of pony that combines the powers of a Pegasus and a unicorn, from My Little Pony, reserved solely for elite characters. Yeah, again, this is almost like High Guardian Spice, crappy, pretentious ideas of writing, and I've watched High Guardian Spice, and that show is almost comparable to the levels that Chris writes, ironically. No modding. Sonichu issue 13. The issue that focuses on an incoherent series of plot threads that the idea guys were brainwashing into Chris and to believing. When Louis was attacked by cloakers, Chris proceeded to send Cwikville's entire army division, the Quick Defense, and his team of Autobots, led by his own Autobot car, Sonchu, to her aid. After Uzume managed to make herself whole again and asked Chris for her powers back, Chris effortlessly transferred the powers within himself back to Uzume while still keeping Uzume's seal. Chris zapped a hotel with lightning because it was full of criminals. Their crimes are unknown to this point, but Chris's judgment is so divine, so who the hell cares? When someone else had become mayor of Cwikville, Chris destroyed the Cwikville Mall, killing thousands, and the non-mayor, showing how he is the true and honest mayor of Cwikville. When Monica tried to wipe out Chris's memories, it didn't work, because Chris was immune. Then Cwikville was clear. All the baddies were gone, and everything that went back to normal because Chris said so. At some point, all 5 of the Sailor Scout souls came to Chris and spoke kind words that blessed his heart crystal, which grew his powers. Chris showcases his goddess complex by likening himself to the CPU goddess of hyperdimension Neptunia. When he was having a conversation with Louis at a lovely cafe, Chris broke down and cried, claiming that due to his online history, no one would hire him, taking into account that he looks like a middle-aged misanthrope playing dress-up with a toddler and smells like the dumpster he lives in. He then continues to cry, screaming that his responsibilities are nearly endless. When Jams de Sonichu was tried for sexual harassment, Chris obstructed the law by sending his good vibes towards the courthouse, and the judge declared Jams de Sonichu not guilty. When the Australian Antilles attacked Cwikville, Chris was able to regroup the Cwikville forces with all his level 100 Pokemon that he had accumulated over the years. Chris created the CPU battery-charged Blueheart in an attempt to pray for the war to end. In an attempt to save Simola from burning alive, Chris projects himself and sets psychic barriers, magically withstanding the heat and agony of their flamethrowers. Chris admits that with the help of Magi-chan, he realized that all the messages from God Jesus that he had received so far had only been a can messing with the goddess complex, by announcing that he no longer believes in God, but rather in the CPU goddesses. That is, are you guys following this? Because I'm trying to, but all you really need to know is that Chris takes complete control and does some incredibly heinous things that he thinks are just going to make things work. He is also victorious in the Cwikville War by making the Nazis retreat. Chris claims to be able to appear in multiple places at once, not feel pain, and kill everyone he does not like with lightning speed. Moreover, anytime a Nazi misgenders him, they turn into a liquid paste after being magically doused in Chris's blood. And all the Nazis not liquefied turn into Sonichus. 7 Chris Chan Sonichu statues are erected in Cwikville, reminding its citizens of who they have to worship. Because also something about Magi-chan being able to psychically wipe out people as if he was the Fort Police on speed. Sonichu 14. Chris begins this issue by describing his great destiny and why he is a unique Sonichu. Well, unique is one way to put it. Sonichu conveys to the reader that Chris has always had special abilities. There's a shock. That his future is predetermined and how he goes above and beyond to keep him safe. Chris claims that he even personally helped to save numerous days in a superheroic manner. Chris recounts how he utilized the Reality Stone to undo all the harm the Idea Guys caused to C-197 dimension before punishing them. Chris reminds us that significant occurrences are all connected to him and that he serves as one of the main deity conduits for the merge. Chris claims that his soul and thoughts are somehow projected everywhere, and that the heavy energy coming from the heart aura makes his numb body totally functioning. Chris's efforts to categorize his uncontrollable, loud, long, thunderous belches as a drawback of being a goddess, and not his poor diet. Chris asserts that his psychic abilities astound a doctor. Chris displays his sense of self-importance by claiming that he was unable to lucid dream Emmanuel, Jesus, Buddha, the CPU goddesses, and all the other deities intervened in his dreams and attempted to assist him by reminding him of the CPU goddesses' powers and how to use them. Chris rambles on and on and on, asserting that he literally shares a subspace and subdimension with all of the other deities in the galaxy with his subconscious. Chris asserts that he sang and danced in tandem with the actors on stage during the BronyCon Grand Galloping Gala without any prior experience or training. He draws a scene showing that he captivated a few attendants behind him who were surprised by his skills. Chris attributes these events to his magical powers rather than his ego playing tricks on him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is literally all we have time for. And if you don't mind me, ladies and gentlemen, well, that was a lot. That was a lot to talk about. That was a lot to unpack. And there were a lot of things that, to be honest, made me angry because any other person, if they took a look in the mirror and saw what they were eventually becoming, they would either settle for peace or completely stop in their tracks because of the reality of what they were doing and what they were saying. But not to Chris. What you see is what you get, and what Chris is ultimately concerned about, the bottom line, is himself. And if that means making himself look like a jackass, if that means making himself look as though he is completely immune from criticism, then so be it. Because life was simply too hard for Chris. But you know what? Like I said before, life is pretty hard for a lot of people all over the world. It doesn't give anybody the right to behave like maniacs, or to shell responsibility, or to fuck your own mothers. Just saying. And I suppose really the most interesting perhaps aspect about this is exploring the fact that was this really the ultimate conclusion of Chris's experiences leading into adult life? Is this one of those cases where it was the result and not the cause of Chris's way of life is why he got to this point? Or was it the other way around? Or perhaps this was just simply the cruel reminder of what happens when you feel as though the word humble is a word that is just in the dictionary, and that it has no relation or bearing to the outside world whatsoever. The only real reality, ladies and gentlemen, and I spoke this before, is the few cubic centimeters inside one's skull. And Chris, just like his ego, might even be smaller than that. All of this culminating in the fact that Chris's actual contributions to life, the outside world, everything else we probably talked about in this article, all amounts to one thing and one thing only. That Chris's ego, his hubris, believing he could fly to the very sun and come crashing back down to earth, because unfortunately reality has a very uncanny way of coming back around and literally forcing Chris back down to earth with a bump. And with all that being said and done, I hope you guys have learned something from this article, and I cannot wait to talk to you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.